A young man kneels on a tatami mat, his forehead pressed to the floor, his hands flat before him. He has done nothing violent. He has broken no law that any court would recognize. And yet, in the eyes of everyone who matters to him, he has committed an unforgivable act. He arrived at a neighbor's home 3 minutes late for a scheduled visit. To modern ears, that might sound absurd, but in the world we are about to enter, lateness was not a scheduling problem. It was a public declaration that another person's time, another person's dignity, meant less to you than your own convenience. And in a society built almost entirely on invisible obligations, that declaration could unravel a family's reputation for a generation. This is the story of a civilization that ran, for centuries, not on written law, but on something far more powerful and far more dangerous: unspoken rules. Rules nobody had to say out loud because everyone already knew them. Rules that governed how you bowed, how you sat, how you apologized, how you owed debts that could never be measured in money, and how you carried shame that could never be washed away. Break one of these rules, and you might lose more than your reputation. You might lose your place in the world entirely. How did a society construct such an intricate, invisible architecture of behavior? Why did people submit to obligations so demanding that they sometimes ended lives? And what did ordinary Japanese men and women actually do, every single day, to keep this fragile social order from collapsing? To understand that, we have to go back, past the modern age, past the wars, into the villages, the castle towns, and the quiet farming communities where these rules were first carved into the human soul. Long before Japan had anything resembling a unified legal code, its society was already organizing itself around a concept so central that it barely needed a name. Historians and anthropologists later called it wa, meaning harmony, but to the people living inside it, it was simply how the world worked. Harmony was not a nice sentiment, it was survival. In a mountainous archipelago where arable land was scarce and rice cultivation demanded coordinated labor from entire communities, a single disruptive person could threaten the food supply of dozens of families. If the irrigation channels weren't shared fairly, if planting and harvesting weren't synchronized, the whole village suffered. Harmony, then, was not born from gentle philosophy. It was born from necessity, sharpened over centuries into a moral code that touched every relationship a person would ever have. By the time we reach the Edo period, beginning in 1603 under the Tokugawa shogunate, this ancient impulse toward harmony had calcified into one of the most rigidly structured societies in recorded history. The shogunate divided the population into a hierarchy known as shino kosho: warriors at the top, then farmers, then artisans, then merchants. On paper, it looks like a simple pyramid. In practice, it was a living machine, and every person inside it had a script to follow from the moment they woke until the moment they closed their eyes at night. Picture a farming village at dawn, mist still clinging to the rice paddies. A farmer does not simply decide to plant when he feels ready. The timing, the labor-sharing arrangements with neighboring households, even the order in which fields are worked, are dictated by generations of unwritten custom. If you want to understand why, you need to understand a concept that sat at the very heart of Japanese social obligation: on. On was a debt of gratitude, but calling it a debt barely captures its weight. If a lord protected your land, if a neighbor helped raise your barn, if a teacher shaped your character, you incurred on toward them. And on was not something you could simply repay and be done with. It was something you carried, sometimes for a lifetime, sometimes across generations. Failing to acknowledge on was not merely rude, it was a violation of the moral fabric that held the entire community together. And here is where the story gets more intense, because on demanded a response, and that response had its own name: giri. Giri was duty, obligation, the active repayment of the debts life had placed upon you. If your neighbor once helped your family during a famine, giri meant you would help them without hesitation when their turn of misfortune came, even if it cost you dearly. Giri bound samurai to their lords, wives to their husbands' families, apprentices to their masters, and children to their parents. It was a debt that compounded with every kindness received and every year that passed. Some historians describe giri as one of the most psychologically demanding social systems ever devised, because it left almost no room for pure self-interest. Every action was, in some sense, already owed to someone else. If you're starting to sense that this world left very little space for individual freedom, you're beginning to understand why the stakes of breaking these rules could be so severe. But before we get to the consequences, we need to talk about the institution that made all of this possible, the very foundation upon which giri, on, and harmony were built. And it wasn't the shogun's court. It was something far closer to home. The ie, or household, was the true engine of Japanese social order for centuries. It is easy to mistake the ie for a Western-style nuclear family, but that comparison fails almost immediately. The ie was not a group of individuals bound by affection. It was a continuous institution, a corporate entity stretching backward through ancestors and forward through descendants yet unborn. And every living member existed, in a very real sense, as a temporary steward of that lineage. The household had a name, often a trade, sometimes land, and always a reputation. And that reputation belonged to everyone who carried the family name, whether they had personally earned it or not. This is crucial to understanding why individual behavior mattered so intensely. If a son gambled away money in a distant town, it wasn't merely his shame, it was his father's shame, his grandfather's shame, his household's shame, visible to every neighbor who had ever done business with that family. Reputation, once damaged, did not simply belong to the person who damaged it. It spread outward like ink in water, staining everyone connected by blood or by name. This is part of why Japanese households developed such elaborate codes of public behavior. A bowl held a fraction too shallow, a gift offered without the proper wrapping, a guest seated in the wrong position relative to the alcove. These were not mere etiquette failures. They were signals, read instantly by everyone present, about whether a family understood its place in the social order and respected the people around it. If you want to know just how seriously this was taken, consider the seating arrangement in a traditional Japanese room. The most honored position, called kamiza, was located farthest from the entrance, typically in front of the tokonoma, the alcove where a scroll or flower arrangement was displayed. The least honored position, shimoza, sat closest to the door. Guests did not need to be told where to sit. They were expected to know, instinctively, based on their rank relative to everyone else in the room. Imagine the quiet tension of entering a room at a formal gathering, scanning the faces already seated, and calculating in seconds exactly where your social standing placed you. Sit too close to the honored position, and you announce an arrogance that could humiliate your entire family. Sit too far, and you might insult your host by implying the arrangement didn't matter to you. There was no room for guessing. You were expected to simply know. This obsession with correct positioning extended far beyond seating. It touched the depth of a bow, called ojigi, which varied by circumstance with startling precision. A slight nod of 15 degrees might suffice between social equals in casual settings. A deeper bow of 30 degrees was appropriate for greeting someone of higher status, and a full 45 to 70 degree bow, sometimes held for several seconds, was reserved for the most solemn apologies or the deepest gratitude. Bow the wrong depth to the wrong person, and you weren't simply awkward. You were making a public statement about how much respect you believed that person deserved, a statement everyone around you would notice, remember, and quietly judge. Now, you might be wondering how anyone survived childhood in a world with this many invisible tripwires, and the truth is, they were taught. From an extraordinarily young age, Japanese children were immersed in the concept of seikente, the watching eyes of society. Seikente is difficult to translate perfectly into English, but it roughly means the awareness that you are always, in some sense, being observed and judged by your community, and that this judgment reflects not just on you, but on everyone connected to you. Mothers would remind children before leaving the house to behave properly, not because misbehavior might get them punished directly, but because it would bring shame upon the household in the eyes of the neighbors. This wasn't paranoia. In small, tightly knit villages, and even in the bustling merchant districts of cities like Edo and Osaka, everyone genuinely did know everyone else's business, and reputations were currency as real as rice or silver. If you're enjoying this glimpse into a world where every gesture carried meaning, stick around, because we're about to descend into the world of the samurai, where these unwritten rules stopped being about embarrassment and started becoming, quite literally, a matter of life and death. The samurai class, roughly 10% of Japan's population during the Edo period, lived under a moral framework that later came to be known as Bushido, the way of the warrior. It's worth pausing here to note something historians have increasingly clarified. Bushido, as a fully codified philosophical system, was largely formalized and romanticized in written texts during the late Edo period and afterward, drawing on centuries of warrior customs that had existed in less systematic forms earlier. The core values it described, however, loyalty, honor, martial discipline, and a willingness to die rather than live in disgrace, were genuinely lived principles among samurai families for generations before they were written down as a unified code. For a samurai, honor was not an abstract virtue. It was almost a physical possession, something that could be damaged, stolen, or lost entirely, and once lost, extraordinarily difficult to recover. A samurai who suffered public humiliation, who failed his lord, or who was defeated in a manner considered disgraceful, faced a stark reality. Continuing to live might be seen as a greater dishonor than dying. This is the origin of seppuku, the ritual suicide by disembowelment that has fascinated and horrified observers for centuries. Seppuku was not a punishment inflicted by others in most cases. It was, in its most idealized form, a final act of self-determination, a way for a warrior to demonstrate that his spirit remained disciplined and his honor intact even in the face of catastrophic failure. The ritual itself was highly formalized, often performed with a witness present, sometimes accompanied by a second warrior, the kaishakunin, whose role was to end the condemned man's suffering with a swift strike immediately after the fatal cut was made. It's a haunting image, and historically, it was reserved largely for the warrior class, though there are documented cases involving others under specific extreme circumstances. But here's what's genuinely fascinating, and something many people don't realize. The vast majority of samurai never performed seppuku. Most lived out relatively administrative lives, especially by the mid to late Edo period, when centuries of relative peace under Tokugawa rule transformed many samurai from battlefield warriors into bureaucrats, tax collectors, and government officials. And yet, the psychological weight of Bushido's ideals never disappeared. Even a samurai pushing paperwork in a provincial office understood that his family's honor, accumulated over generations of service, could be erased by a single act of cowardice or disloyalty. This is perhaps one of the most striking truths about the hidden rules of Japanese society. You did not need to be on a battlefield for the stakes to feel life or death. The rules followed you into the mundane corners of everyday existence. Loyalty, Chu, was the beating heart of the samurai's relationship to his lord, and it demanded something extraordinary: the subordination of personal desire, personal safety, and sometimes personal morality to the will and welfare of one's superior. There are documented historical accounts, preserved in warrior clan records and later popularized in works like The Story of the 47 Ronin, of samurai who sacrificed everything, reputation, family, life itself, to fulfill obligations of loyalty that any outside observer might consider disproportionate to the offense that triggered them. The story of the 47 Ronin, based on real events from 1701 to 1703, tells of a group of samurai who spent nearly 2 years secretly plotting revenge for their lord's forced suicide, ultimately assassinating the official responsible, knowing full well that the act would require them to face execution or be ordered to commit seppuku themselves. Nearly all of them ultimately did take their own lives by ritual suicide, following through on their loyalty even in death. Whatever your feelings about the morality of that story, it reveals something profound about how deeply Chu could be embedded in a person's sense of identity. For these men, loyalty was not a preference, it was who they were. Now, here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If honor and loyalty demanded this much from the samurai, what did they demand from everyone else? The farmers, the artisans, the merchants who made up the overwhelming majority of the population and who had no swords, no warrior code, and no battlefield glory to aspire to. The answer takes us back to the villages, where a different but equally binding set of rules governed daily life. Rural communities during the Edo period operated under a system of collective responsibility known as gun and gumi, or 5-person groups. Neighboring households were formally organized into small clusters, and each cluster bore shared responsibility for the behavior of its members. If one household failed to pay its taxes, committed a crime, or violated local regulations, the entire group could face consequences, fines, forced labor, or public censure. Imagine the social pressure this created. Your neighbor's mistake was not simply their problem, it was yours. This system, instituted formally by the shogunate but building on older communal customs, transformed social harmony from a personal virtue into a matter of collective survival. Gossip, surveillance, and mutual monitoring weren't just tolerated in this environment. They were essential tools that communities used to protect themselves from the fallout of one member's misbehavior. If you've ever wondered why traditional Japanese communities developed such a powerful, almost instinctive aversion to standing out or causing trouble, the Gon-and-Gumi system offers one compelling piece of the answer. And this brings us to a phrase that captures, perhaps more vividly than any other, the danger of violating these unwritten rules. The nail that sticks up gets hammered down. This proverb, deeply embedded in Japanese cultural consciousness, wasn't simply advice about modesty. It was a description of lived reality. A person who drew too much attention to themselves, through arrogance, through visible ambition, through public displays of individuality that clashed with communal expectations, risked social correction that could range from gentle teasing to complete ostracism. And ostracism, called murahachibu in its most severe historical form, was no small matter. The term literally referred to a village practice of excluding a household from 8 of the 10 essential forms of community cooperation, while still assisting with the 2 considered too critical to withhold even from a disgraced family: firefighting and funeral assistance. Think about what that means. A community would let you struggle, let you be shunned, let you lose access to shared labor, tools, and mutual aid. But they would still help if your house caught fire or if someone in your family died, because even punishment had its limits, and even the most severely ostracized household remained, in some fundamental sense, part of the human community. This delicate, almost paradoxical balance between punishment and enduring obligation tells us something remarkable about how Japanese society understood the relationship between the individual and the group. You could be disciplined almost to the point of erasure, but you were never entirely abandoned. If you're finding this as fascinating as I do, now would be a great moment to hit that like button, because we're about to explore something that touched every single person in this society, regardless of class. The elaborate, almost theatrical world of gift-giving and social debt. Gift-giving in traditional Japan was never simply an act of generosity. It was a language, a system of obligations exchanged in physical form, and getting it wrong could cause real social damage. Consider the practice of ochugen and osaibo, seasonal gift exchanges, that developed over centuries and became particularly elaborate during the Edo period among merchant families and their business relationships. These gifts were carefully calibrated by rank, by the closeness of the relationship, and by the value of favors previously exchanged. A gift too modest might insult the recipient by implying the relationship mattered less than it should. A gift too extravagant could embarrass the recipient by creating a debt they couldn't comfortably repay. Or worse, could be read as an attempt to buy influence inappropriately. Merchants, despite occupying the lowest official rank in the social hierarchy, often possessed enormous wealth, and this created a fascinating tension. How do you display gratitude and maintain relationships with samurai patrons or guild superiors without appearing to overstep your station? The answer lay in meticulous attention to wrapping, presentation, timing, and the specific items chosen, each carrying symbolic weight that everyone in the exchange understood implicitly. Even the act of refusing a gift carried its own etiquette. It was customary, in many contexts, to initially decline an offered gift once or even twice before finally accepting it, a small ritual dance that demonstrated humility and ensured the giver's generosity was not taken for granted. Fail to perform this dance, accept too eagerly, and you risked appearing greedy or presumptuous. Perform it too many times, refuse too persistently, and you risked insulting your host by seeming to reject their goodwill. There was, quite literally, a correct number of times to say no before saying yes. This same principle of calibrated restraint extended into one of the most misunderstood aspects of traditional Japanese communication: the art of indirect refusal. Saying no directly, especially to a request from someone of higher status or to a business or social proposal, was often considered abrupt to the point of rudeness. Instead, a person might respond with phrases that translated roughly to, "That would be a bit difficult," or "I will think about it carefully." Phrases that, to an outsider, might sound like genuine possibilities, but that everyone within the culture understood as polite refusals. This indirectness wasn't dishonesty. It was a sophisticated social technology designed to preserve the dignity of both parties, allowing a request to be declined without forcing anyone into open confrontation or public loss of face. Historians studying merchant correspondence and diplomatic records from the Edo period have found countless examples of this careful linguistic choreography. Letters and negotiations, where the true meaning lay not in what was said, but in the precise, deliberate way something was left unsaid. Speaking of what went unsaid, we need to talk about one of the most emotionally significant unwritten rules of all: the management of public emotion. Traditional Japanese social codes placed enormous value on emotional restraint in public settings, a concept sometimes described through the lens of honi and tatame, one's true feelings versus the face presented to the world. This wasn't about suppressing emotion entirely or pretending it didn't exist. Rather, it reflected a deep cultural understanding that unleashed emotion, whether anger, grief, or even excessive joy, could disrupt the delicate social harmony that communities depended upon. A merchant who had just lost a fortune in a failed venture was expected to maintain composure in front of business associates, not because his loss didn't matter, but because visible distress might alarm creditors, damage confidence, or burden others with emotional weight they hadn't consented to carry. A samurai receiving devastating news on the battlefield was expected to process it internally, maintaining the outward calm that his men depended upon for their own morale and discipline. This doesn't mean private life was devoid of genuine feeling, far from it. Personal diaries, poetry, and letters from across Japanese history reveal individuals wrestling with grief, longing, frustration, and joy just as intensely as people anywhere else in the world. The rule wasn't that you couldn't feel deeply. The rule was that you controlled where and how those feelings became visible, understanding that public composure was itself a form of respect toward the people around you, a way of not imposing your private storm onto their shared calm. Now, let's turn to a domain where these hidden rules reach perhaps their most intricate and demanding expression: the tea ceremony, or chanoyu. Formalized significantly by figures like Sen no Rikyu in the 16th century, the tea ceremony might look, at first glance, like a simple ritual of preparing and serving tea. In reality, it was an entire universe of unspoken rules compressed into a small room. Every movement, how you entered the tea room, often through a small crawl-through entrance called a nijiraguchi, designed specifically to force even the highest-ranking samurai to lower himself humbly before entering, how you held the tea bowl, the precise angle at which you turned it before drinking, how many sips you took, how you complimented the host on the choice of utensils. All of it was governed by rules refined over generations. And crucially, the rules existed not for their own sake, but to create a temporary space where social rank dissolved into shared aesthetic and spiritual experience. Inside the tea room, even a powerful lord was expected to observe the same humble entrance as his subordinates. For a few precious minutes, the rigid hierarchy that governed every other aspect of life was suspended, replaced by a different kind of hidden rule entirely: the rule of shared mindfulness, respect for the present moment, and appreciation of simple beauty. It's a remarkable thing to consider that a society so obsessed with hierarchy also carved out sacred spaces specifically designed to temporarily dissolve it. If you've been wondering why all of this mattered so intensely, why people submitted to rules this demanding, this precise, this unforgiving, the answer lies in something we touched on earlier, but deserves deeper reflection now: the fear of shame, known broadly as haji. Shame in traditional Japanese society was not merely an internal emotional state. It was understood as fundamentally social, something that existed in the eyes of the community, and that could attach itself not just to an individual, but, as we've discussed, to an entire household and its descendants. This is part of why some scholars have characterized aspects of traditional Japanese social morality as oriented around shame and honor made visible to others, in contrast to purely internalized guilt. This distinction, while useful, shouldn't be overstated. Internal conscience and personal moral conviction were absolutely present throughout Japanese history, documented extensively in religious writings, personal letters, and philosophical texts. But the social dimension of shame carried a weight that shaped behavior in profound and observable ways, because a shamed family might struggle to arrange marriages for their children, might lose business partnerships built over decades, might find neighbors quietly withdrawing the mutual aid that rural life depended upon. This fear of collective shame is precisely why marriage itself, in traditional Japanese society, was rarely treated as a purely personal decision. For centuries, particularly among samurai and merchant families, marriages were arranged often through a formal matchmaker known as a nakodo, whose role extended far beyond simply introducing potential partners. The nakodo evaluated family reputation, financial standing, social rank, and even the compatibility of household customs, because a marriage wasn't merely uniting two individuals, it was merging two households, two lineages of accumulated on and giri, two reputations that would now be permanently intertwined. A poorly matched marriage could damage both families for a generation. This is why the negotiations preceding a formal marriage proposal could stretch on for months, involving careful investigation into a family's history, their conduct, and any hint of past scandal. Love, when it existed within these arranged unions, was often expected to develop gradually after marriage rather than serve as its foundation, a fundamentally different philosophy of partnership than many outside this cultural context would recognize, but one that made complete sense within a worldview where individual happiness was consistently weighed against communal and familial stability. Children born into this world absorb these hidden rules almost through osmosis, but formal education reinforced them explicitly as well. Temple schools known as Terrakoya, which flourished particularly during the latter half of the Edo period and achieved remarkably high literacy rates for a pre-modern society, taught reading and writing, yes, but also embedded moral education directly into their curriculum. Textbooks used in these schools often included stories illustrating filial piety, loyalty, and proper conduct, ensuring that even before a child could fully articulate why bowing at a certain angle mattered, they understood, on some deep intuitive level, that the world expected it of them. We've journeyed through villages bound by collective responsibility, through samurai households where honor outweighed life itself, through tea rooms where hierarchy dissolved into shared humility, and through the careful, almost musical choreography of gift-giving, gesture, and restrained speech. And perhaps what emerges most clearly from all of this is not a portrait of a rigid, oppressive society, though the demands placed on individuals were undeniably immense. What emerges instead is a portrait of a civilization that took the fragile, difficult work of living alongside other human beings with profound seriousness. Every bow, every carefully worded refusal, every ritual of gift and gratitude was an attempt to answer one of the oldest and hardest questions any community must face. How do we live together without destroying each other? The hidden rules of traditional Japanese society were demanding, sometimes unforgiving, occasionally tragic in their consequences. But they were also, in their own intricate way, an extraordinary act of collective imagination, a civilization deciding, over the course of many centuries, that harmony was worth the sacrifice of unchecked individual will, that honor was worth defending even at ultimate cost, and that the quiet, careful management of human relationships deserved the same seriousness that other cultures reserve for law, or war, or religion. It is a world we can only glimpse now through surviving records, preserved rituals, and the echoes of customs that once governed nearly every waking moment of an entire civilization's life. If this journey into the hidden architecture of a remarkable society captivated you as much as it captivated me in the telling, subscribe for more deep dives into the histories, customs, and hidden worlds that shaped humanity. And I'll see you in the next one.